Man, this whole back and forth between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, that's been taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room lately.
Yeah, it's definitely been front and center. I think for anyone trying to make sense of what it means for hip hop, especially when you start comparing it to those classic rivalries, we need to take a deep dive here.
For sure. And the thing is, there are all sorts of perspectives on this. We've got this really interesting conversation here that went down after all the recent tracks dropped. And it's trying to put everything into perspective by comparing it to, well, to the granddaddy of them all, Jay-Z and Nas.
Right, exactly. So what we're really going to unpack today is this. Where does Drake go from here? Is this a sign that things are changing for good, or is it just a temporary blip? And using the Jay-Z Nas situation gives us a really useful framework to think about it.
Totally. So to even begin to understand what's happening now, I think we need to remember just how huge Drake has been in the industry. I mean, 10 years in a row as the top streaming artist worldwide. That's not just success. That's like a whole era of dominating the charts.
It's incredible, and the discussion we're looking at here, it really drives home that point about Drake's influence, They actually make the point that he's helped to launch something like 6 or 7 other rappers into global stardom. That combination of staying power and being able to elevate others, it's pretty rare.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the big comparison being made. Drake versus Kendrick, like the modern day version of Jay-Z versus Nas. Now, for people who aren't total hip-hop historians, can you give us the rundown on the whole Jay-Z-Nas rivalry? What do we really need to know to understand how it connects to all this?
Yeah, definitely. So the Jay-Z and Nas beef, it was really intense in the early 2000s. These were two incredibly skilled artists, both with their own styles and their own path, right? You had Jay-Z, who at that point was already super successful, like mainstream success, and a lot of people saw him as the king of New York. Then you had Nas, who had this crazy reputation for his lyrical skills, like amazing storytelling and wordplay. And all this tension, it finally exploded into diss tracks, and Nas' Ether, which was a direct response to Jay-Z's Takeover, and it's still seen as this legendary takedown. It really hit hard. And there's also this famous Rap City freestyle where Nas just went in, really dropped some serious bars. For a lot of people, Ether felt like a huge win for Nas at the time.
Right. Ether is this almost mythical event in hip-hop. But here's where it gets super interesting. What they're arguing in our source material is that even though Ether was a big deal, ultimately, it was Jay-Z who ended up on top in the long run, in terms of his career and his overall influence. And they're actually predicting that Drake will do the same thing, that he'll ultimately supersede Kendrick Lamar. Despite what's going on right now, what leads them to that conclusion?
Okay, so they're basing that prediction on a few different things. And the first one is their output, how much music they put out.
Yeah.
Kendrick is a lot like Nas in this way, where he releases music less often. It's more of a deliberate, measured approach. But Drake, he's constantly dropping new stuff. He's always in the news. He's connecting with a much wider audience. You just can't escape Drake. It seems like there's always something new.
Yeah, it's like two totally different ways of being in the industry, right? They touch on this in the conversation, how Kendrick seems to kind of operate outside of that need to constantly create content, while Drake, even if he has his complaints, is very much part of that machine.
Absolutely.
And they also talk about their public personas, how they handle themselves. Kendrick is seen as someone who lets his music speak for itself. He doesn't get into the drama. He doesn't usually directly respond to stuff. But then you have Drake, or Aubrey, as they jokingly call him in this conversation, and he's much more reactive. He's more vocal when he feels disrespected, and he's much more willing to get involved in industry issues. There's even this quote where they say, Aubrey, on the other hand, I don't like it. I don't like this youth streaming service. I don't like this. I don't like that. I'll sue you. I don't like this, that sucker behavior. I don't like it. And Aubrey speaks. Yeah, it really highlights how Drake is seen as someone who's really engaged in the business side of things and in all the drama that comes with it.
So how they navigate the industry, how they present themselves, all of that is being seen as crucial to how their careers might play out. But there's this really interesting counterpoint that they bring up, which is that this situation, it feels different. Unlike Nas in his rivalry with Jay-Z, a lot of people are saying that Kendrick actually won this exchange, like straight up. What's the thinking behind that?
It's a major difference from the Jay-Z-Nas comparison. With Ether, yeah, it was huge, but there was always this sense that Nas was the underdog going up against the more commercially successful Jay-Z. With Drake and Kendrick, it's not the same. The feeling is that Kendrick, even if he's not always topping the charts like Drake, he's always been on a similar level, both artistically and culturally. So this recent back and forth is being seen by a lot of people as a clear win for Kendrick, like a real victory.
And it seems like a big part of that is this idea that Drake's lost some of his cool They're saying that his appeal might be shifting to a more mainstream, even maybe a mostly white audience, and that his sensitivity or the fact that he feels the need to respond to everything is seen as a weakness, especially in black music. They even say it flat out, sensitive doesn't work in black music. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's a blunt statement, and it definitely reflects a certain viewpoint. The idea is that in hip-hop, there's always been this emphasis on toughness, on being able to handle things, to bounce back. And Drake's more emotional responses, they might not resonate as much with that core audience, but then they immediately counter that with some real-world observations.
Right, because then they talk about how popular Drake still is in real life, his music is everywhere, people still see him as super successful, and they even mention stories about women being really attracted to his success and his whole persona. It shows how the story online might not be the whole story. What does that tell us?
It makes you wonder how we're defining success and cultural relevance, right? Are we putting too much weight on what people are saying on social media, or should we be looking at the bigger picture of how popular and influential someone is? And then the conversation shifts to how Drake is responding, or maybe more like how he's not responding in a certain way.
This whole thing about Drake supposedly thinking about suing instead of responding with diss tracks, that's fascinating. In the discussion, they frame it as maybe talking above your audience. Like there's a disconnect between how Drake's handling it and what people expect in a traditional hip-hop beef. Could you explain that a bit more, this idea of talking above your audience?
Sure. It has to do with the unwritten rules of hip-hop, where you're supposed to engage directly to show off your lyrical skills when someone comes at you. Going the corporate route, taking legal action, it can be seen as avoiding the fight, like maybe you don't understand or respect how things are done in hip-hop. It's about authenticity and how you engage within the culture of the genre. And this actually leads to another really interesting observation. The level of mainstream media coverage this whole thing has gotten.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is on Entertainment Tonight, The View, even Fox Sports and TMZ. They're saying that this level of mainstream attention is unusual for a rap beef, and they're suggesting it might have to do with Drake being biracial. The idea is that his background creates a different kind of story, one that resonates with mainstream media outlets in a different way. What do you think about that angle?
It's a complicated and sensitive point, for sure. They're suggesting that the media's interest might go beyond just the music and the lyrics. It might tie into bigger conversations about race, identity, and representation in society. It's possible that the story around Drake is being framed differently, and that's why it's getting more attention from mainstream outlets compared to artists with different backgrounds.
And then, almost as a final thought about Drake's future, they bring up one of his lyrics, "She looked like a star but only on camera, hard as fuck, nigga." And they suggest it might hint at the kind of energy he needs to tap into to get back some of that coolness that some people think he's lost. Why do they point to that specific line?
It's interesting, right? Because that line, if you take away the more controversial parts, it represents a certain kind of raw energy, a willingness to be less polished, more direct. What they're suggesting is that maybe Drake needs to go back to that kind of authenticity, that connection with a core audience on a deeper level. It might be the key to winning back some of the listeners who think he's become too mainstream, too focused on a broader audience that's not as into hip-hop.
So as we wrap this up, we've really explored this central question, haven't we? On the one hand, there's this argument that Drake's dominance and his consistent releases, kind of like Jay-Z's trajectory, will probably see him through this. But then there's this really strong counter-argument that this situation is different, that Kendrick's impact has been much deeper, and that it signals a real shift, maybe similar to what Ether did, but with a different outcome in the long run.
Exactly, and what makes it so interesting is that we're trying to analyze these cultural moments as they're happening. It's all very subjective. We're looking at it through all these different lenses. Industry numbers, street cred, what the media is saying, what the fans are feeling, and they all give us slightly different perspectives on what's going on and what it all means.
It makes you think, right? For everyone listening, when you think about everything we've talked about, the artistry, the cultural context, how public perception is always changing, what do you think are the most important factors for long-term success and legacy in a field as competitive and as important as hip-hop? Is it about dominating the charts year after year, or is it about those moments that really make an impact, the ones that people remember?
It's definitely something to think about.